So welcome back, everybody, to day 2 of our conference on Where Next for Development Effectiveness. And a particular welcome to any of you who weren't here yesterday who've joined us. Very nice to see old faces and new faces here today. So just to start off, Catherine Blampied, who is a research officer here at ODI and has been very instrumental in making this conference happen, is going to give us a quick recap. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, or for those of you who were here yesterday but drank too much wine last night and can't remember, she's going to summarize the key issues that were discussed yesterday, and then we will move to the main panel after that. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Romilly. Is this on? Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so before I begin with the very exciting recap of yesterday's events, a couple of quick points of information and housekeeping to get out the way. One of those is we've had a bit of a wrist slap, I believe, and so could I ask those smokers in the room who would like to have a smoke, if you could please make sure that you actually leave the college grounds rather than staying inside the courtyard, because apparently we're not allowed to do that. And the second point I'd like to bring up before I forget is that for those who were here yesterday will know, we're going for quite a tech-savvy feel to this conference, and so we've been using an online tool called Pigeonhole, which you can see the details of on the screen. So you basically just go to a website and enter this passcode, and this is a mechanism that we'll be using in this first session with Romilly and some of the other sessions to submit your questions and get the discussion going. So we thought it'd be a nice idea for those who weren't here yesterday just to give a quick recap. And another thing that I would very much encourage you to do, if you haven't already, is to go and take a look at the rather amazing and beautiful cartoon board at the back. We have a wonderful cartoonist drawing the events as they happen, so please do go and make sure you take a look at that. So what did we talk about yesterday? We had an opening panel. We first had a keynote address by Minister Gondwe of Malawi, who's one of the 3 co-chairs of the Global Partnership, where he laid out the challenges ahead. And in that, one of the things that struck me was his insistence on the idea that if we're to leave no one behind, we can't just rely on the central government. When we talk about leave no one behind, we're talking about an effective development. In doing that, we really need to engage local actors and bring them in, such as local governments and CSOs. We also, in that session, had an exclusive, I think, sneak peek of the new monitoring survey data from Brenda Killen, which I think showed a mixed picture. But I think there was a lot of concern in the room about some of the trends of stagnation in some key areas of this agenda, such as predictability. The use of country systems came up quite poorly, and accountability as well. So perhaps those are things we can talk about more today. We then had a question time session where we had the chance to hear directly from some officials working in developing country governments. And here it was really interesting to hear from the representatives from Cambodia and Ghana about how the landscape, the financing landscape, is really changing in their countries in terms of reducing ODA flows, the shifts from grants to loans, and that they're really seeing massive financing needs, particularly for things like infrastructure, so they're having to go to newer actors like China and the development banks. And what does that mean for the effectiveness principles? How do they cope in an era of aid graduations and private flows and so on? In the afternoon, we were treated to a rather nice exercise of a policy simulation game, which I think I can say was one of the liveliest and best received sessions of the day. We all formed different stakeholder groups and had to come up with financing offers towards a hypothetical country's new transport strategy. And speaking from the perspective of the group that I was in, the small-scale farmers, for me, that exercise really sparked some really interesting conversations about the nature of one of the key principles of Busan, ownership and sovereignty. Who has legitimacy to deal with whom when you're talking about financing a development plan? Do the smallholder farmers have the right, have the legitimacy to go to a donor like DFID and deal with them if the government is creating a national plan that excludes and marginalizes certain groups? So I thought that was quite interesting. And that particular theme is one that we're going to bring up in the first debate of the day that follows this immediately, which is looking at this tension around ownership and the leave no one behind agenda. Is there a tension there? And then in the final session yesterday, we had another lively one, a debate on whether the effectiveness principle should be applied to investments in the private sector when they're done through things like development finance institutions. And there we had a poll, and I think the ayes had it. I think around 2/3 of the audience in total thought that the existing principles should be applied when ODA is used to subsidize private investments, either with new indicators or adapted indicators, and a much smaller percentage thought that the GPDC shouldn't actually be attempting to monitor that kind of stuff. So I thought I'd just end briefly with my personal top 3 takeaways from yesterday. And what I'd love to do is we're using the hashtag 2016CAPE. So if you weren't here yesterday, do have a look on that thread. And I'd love for everyone who was here yesterday to share their number 1 top takeaway from the day as well. So my 3 are, one thing that really surprised me was that there seemed to be quite a fair level of consensus, and people might disagree with that the principles themselves are actually fine. They're not necessarily outdated. And one of our main arguments coming into this as ODI has been that the framework itself needs to be reassessed because it's outdated. So perhaps people don't agree with us on that, and it'd be interesting to discuss that. We've got a session coming up after lunch called Speed Geeking, which is kind of like a speed dating with 10 development effectiveness geeks who are going to pitch their proposals for what they think needs to change or not with the GPDC. And then we'll have the chance to vote on that. So maybe let's see if those proposals tend to favor getting actors to fulfill old commitments or whether they need to make new commitments. My second key takeaway was a theme that came up repeatedly yesterday, and this can be summarized basically as kind of let's get real. You know, while we're talking about these technical frameworks, what are the underlying power dynamics that are preventing development cooperation providers from actually fulfilling the commitments that are long-standing that they've already agreed to? And Fanwell Bokosi from AfroDead made a great comment in the opening session yesterday. You know, are donors just dropping this now because it's basically just too hard to do? And this issue of the political economy that underlies the development effectiveness framework, we're going to be exploring in our second session this morning, implementing development effectiveness, a reality check. And then my third and final takeaway is another theme that seemed to come up again and again, which I hadn't necessarily thought too much about before, which was this very strongly perceived need for a step change in a level of capacity building and system strengthening. And the question of whether development effectiveness principles are all very nice in theory, but in situations where there are weaker systems that can't be accountable or don't have the capacity to actually implement them, then what are they good for, really? And you know, this came up in the monitoring data with only half of ODA going through country systems still. And so in that case, you know, what is the role for something like the Global Partnership to really incentivize system strengthening and capacity building that perhaps goes beyond simply monitoring these with indicators every couple of years, and we don't seem to be making much progress on that front. So I hope that gives you a little bit of the flavor of some of the conversations that we had yesterday. We had many more. And it also sets out some of the key issues that we'll be addressing in the first 3 sessions of the day. And then we will have a fourth and final session at the end of the day where we're honored to be joined by the Dutch co-chair to the Global Partnership, Ambassador Verheul, and 2 other representatives of other organizations on the steering committee. And this will be the closing plenary, so we do encourage you to stay till the end. We're going to summarize and take stock and reflect on everything that we've discussed. And with this in mind, set us off on the road to Nairobi and think, what do we really think collectively would be our recommendations for that? So I just wanted to add my thanks to everyone for all the contributions you've made so far, and I'm personally looking forward to a very lively and exciting day today as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for a very cogent summary of yesterday, which I'm not sure I would have managed because I feel like there's so much going on. So I think that was a really helpful summary. So we are going to talk today about Leave No One Behind and development effectiveness. This theme came up quite a lot yesterday, which was really good to hear about the new 2030 agenda and the sort of underlying principle around Leave No One Behind. But we want to now get really much more into detail on that theme. And we have about, I think, an hour, just over an hour to do that. So for those that don't know me, I think most of you know me by now, but for those that don't, I'm Romilly Greenhill. I'm the team leader for development finance here in ODI. I'm joined by Helder da Costa, who is the General Secretary of the G7 Plus Secretariat. For those that don't know, the G7 Plus is a group of 20 fragile and conflict-afflicted states who have been working together for some time now on these issues. And he's going to present a little bit the government development perspective and obviously the fragile states perspective. We also have Javier Soraski, I hope I've pronounced that right, who is the Research and Policy Coordinator at CEPE, which is a research institute based in Colombia. And he's also worked as an advisor at the Directorate General for International Cooperation in Argentina. So he has previously a governmental perspective, but he's going to provide us a little bit more the middle-income country and also the sort of non-governmental perspective on the debate. We are again using Pigeonhole for this. Now, I think Catherine mentioned this briefly, but for those who were not here yesterday, I would strongly encourage you to use this. It did seem to work quite well yesterday. All you need to do is to go to www.pigeonhole.at. You can see it on the screen. You log in, 2016 CAPE is the password. And what happens is that anybody who wants to can submit a question online, and then you will have an opportunity to vote for which you think are the most interesting questions, and then those are the questions that will be presented to the panel. So please do engage in that way, and please do vote for the questions that you think are interesting, and then we'll come back to that later. So just by way of background, I wanted to provide a few remarks to sort of set the scene for this discussion. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, but I thought it's just worth reiterating that it does talk about, as we embark on this great collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind, and we will endeavour to reach the furthest behind first. Now, it may seem that we've been doing this for quite some time, but actually saying that we're going to reach the furthest behind first is quite a step change to the MDG era and the previous era. So this is a really new agenda and something that we really need to grapple with in terms of development effectiveness. There will be a plenary on this topic in Nairobi. Some of us here, including ODI, are involved in organising that plenary and doing some of the research. And we are very interested in engaging further with anybody who has points to make or suggestions. So please come and talk to me, or alternatively Isabella Toth, who is somewhere here, she's there, who is coordinating the group if you want to know more about that, the plenary discussion. And we, as ODI, have also been doing some work with CEPE from Colombia around Leave No One Behind and development effectiveness. The first question to address, though, is what do we mean by leaving no one behind, and who is actually left behind? And our research has suggested that there's really two groups that we need to be thinking about. The first is fragile and conflict-affected states, which is why we have Helder here specifically. And some of the projections that colleagues in ODI and elsewhere have done suggest that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of extremely poor people will be living in fragile states by 2030. So we really need to be thinking about leave no state behind in this respect. Then the second group are particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups living across all categories of countries. So that's particularly, for example, people in rural areas, it's women, it's ethnic minorities, it's children. And the evidence suggests that actually people who suffer from more than one of those forms of disadvantage tend to be particularly left behind. So for example, ethnic minority women in rural areas are much more likely to be left behind if they suffer from multiple forms of disadvantage. So just to contextualize that this is what we're really talking about, leave no state behind and leave no person behind. Now thinking about ownership and leave no one behind, and I think we really need to be frank about this. Catherine talked about the sort of political realities of this agenda, and I think we all agree with ownership. It's one of the most widely accepted tenets of the development effectiveness agenda, but it's actually a key tension here, particularly with leave no one behind. Now, we did the policy simulation exercise yesterday, and we did have the smallholder farmers not really being reflected in the government policy on transport, and we had DFID quite reasonably wanting to support those smallholder farmers, but it not being in line with the government strategy. This is actually based on Kenya. This is the reality. I don't know about DFID, actually, but what I do know is that in Kenya, the transport strategy, the road strategy, is all about economic development with a lot of justification. It's all around economic rates of return. There isn't very much consideration of social considerations, and so the vast majority of the money is going into national trunk roads and into regional roads and so forth. Now, the donors in Kenya are quite well aligned, but therefore therefore they are also supporting the national roads and not the feeder roads. So I think there's some real tensions. And of course there's also the more extreme cases where you have governments who are themselves marginalizing groups. As an example, 75 countries criminalize homosexuality. So if you're thinking about LGBT groups as left behind, 75 countries have criminal prosecution for such groups. Similarly, 52 countries don't have provisions to ensure gender equality. So, I mean, I think we don't like to talk about these issues, but I think there's some really difficult issues to address. So I won't go on much further, but I would like to hand over to Helder to provide some brief opening remarks before opening the floor.
Thank you, Romilly. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to ODI for inviting me to be on this panel. It is such a privilege to represent the so-called G7+, which comprises of 20 fragile and post-conflict affected states around the world. Right, before I start, let me share with you a little story of the principle or the tenet of leaving no one behind. Before we arrived to the conclusion of 17 SDGs, which was undergoing some kind of protracted negotiation in New York, ladies and gentlemen, we all remember that before SDGs adoption in New York, the Secretary General assembled a 27-member of high-level panel, which was co-chaired by 3 leaders from Indonesia, former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and the Liberian President, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and your own former UK Prime Minister, David Cameron. In the negotiations that they had behind closed door, in the last minute they had in New York, last minute meeting they had in New York, I remember my colleague, Madam Emilia Pires, who was the former Minister of Finance from Timor-Leste, she was also one of the high-level panel members in that meeting. And she recounted to me that the peace and security issues was almost ditched out of those 12 goals that was proposed by the high-level panel member. I tell you why. Because in the last few minutes before the meeting was closed, before they finalized the goals, UK Prime Minister said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's finish the meeting because those are the goals that we're going to propose without peace and security, because peace and security at that time was regarded as the prerogative rights of the UN Security Council, or P5. Then, at the head table, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was sitting there quietly, and then she raised her place card and said, hang on, I haven't said my words yet, because otherwise this report I'm not going to subscribe, because I also have to say on behalf of fragile and conflict-affected states, which my country also is a part of it. So she said it, if we don't put peace and security in that goal proposed by this high-level panel member, I'm not going to subscribe this. So she put her feet down there. And then that gives us some kind of motivation for the G7+ ambassadors, head of missions in New York, to negotiate this with the G77, with all the other powerful nations around the world. But thank God that with like-minded countries, I believe including UK and others, the Nordic countries and some developing countries, we managed to include goal number 16, which is building peaceful societies in that overall package of the SDGs. Now, why I say this? Because the G7+, which is a voluntary association of those 20 member states, face the risk of being left behind again if we don't take the initiative. Why? Because over the past 15 years, during the MDG period, the MDG was focused more on social and economic issues, but very little or almost none tackled about the peace and security. That's why None of these G7 plus countries during the period of MDG over the past 15 years achieved any single MDGs. So we were left already long time before, 15 years ago. Now, in the next 15 years, the stakes are very high. As Romilly mentioned, that by 2030, all the studies show that the majority of extremely poor people will be living in fragile states. And these will be the people who will be left behind. Last month, and Brenda is here, the OECD also released a report, and it's entitled States of Fragility 2016, A Violent World. Trends show global violence is increasing in scale, complexity, and cost, with civilians most at risk. Out of 66 economies or countries observed in that study, including my group, there are 16 fragile states countries in that study, they identified as fragile situations using the OECD's States of Fragility framework, which basically measure fragility across 5 dimensions: social, political, economical, environment, and security. Sadly, out of those 16 countries, Somalia is the country considered the most affected by fragility. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what does it mean? Before entering turbulent waters, let me focus a bit on the concept of leaving no one behind. And I salute the study that has been done by Romilly and co. regarding the Leave No One Behind, which is available there. We can basically look at Leave No One Behind from 2 perspectives. On the one side, from the people left behind in their own countries, and on the other, from the countries left behind in the community of nations. Being left behind as a person means being marginalized, deprived of healthcare, education, proper nutrition, jobs, clean water, etc. It means being deprived of the conditions that can ensure life with dignity for men and women alike. The SDGs, therefore, are very much about the rights we want to ensure to every and each citizen. On the other side, being left behind as a country in the international system means being overlooked by the international society. This can happen through not assisting fragile and conflict-affected states, for example, with its peace-building and state-building efforts, or extending financial aid in an international manner, for example, leaving aid-dependent states vulnerable and behind vis-à-vis other nations. In both perspectives, in our belief that we touch on very sensitive issues here, such as ownership, sovereignty, non-intervention in domestic affairs, and we also touch the very fundamental principles of international law, of political independence, territorial integrity, and national interest. And how do we tackle those issues? There are neither easy answers nor solutions here, and I commend the researchers here in ODI to bring this issue at the forefront. So what does ownership mean when particular groups are actually being marginalized by the governments? The legitimacy of every government stems from its capacity to attend the needs of its citizens and to respect and promote the fundamental rights. As Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights points out, that, quote, "the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of the government," end of quote. There are times, however, that governments are not in a position to respond to the needs of the people because states are unable and unwilling to do so. Let me just tackle one by one. When they are unable, assistance from the international community becomes vital. Although governments try to respond to the needs of the people, they lack the financial and human capacity and human resource and the technical capacity to do so. In those cases, it is in a big clash with the ownership of the state as long as external assistance allows the empowerment of the state so that in the long term, it will be able to tackle on its core functions. The same thing doesn't happen when states are unwilling to take care of its citizens and populations. We have seen time and again people being left behind due to ethnic, religious, gender, political issues, etc. We have seen the state deliberately inflict suffering and instill fear on its own people. What about ownership on those states? That's why the G7 Plus call for, to remember here, that state sovereignty entails responsibility. And we have seen this in Central African Republic. We have seen this in Guinea-Bissau, when the state coup d'etat, the transitional government came into power, and we had to deal with the transitional government as interlocutor in dealing with their own people. When governments deliberately fail to do so, it is time for diplomacy to act. And therefore, for me, we value very much the New Deal principles for engagement in fragile states. Another New Deal where also complement the Busan Partnership principles where we are talking about here. But the main responsibility for leaving no one behind lies, I have to stress, lies in the hand of the government. External actors come and complement the actors of the government. So this is something that I'd like to hear my colleague Javier as my opponent to come up with the idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helder, for giving that interesting perspective on fragile states and also a little bit of the history of the discussion. So, Javier, this was supposed to be a debate. I don't know how much real disagreement there will be, but maybe you'll give us a non-governmental perspective.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank the ODI for letting me here sharing some ideas with you and learning from you a lot. Yesterday was a very strong day. With new ideas and discussions. And let me also say that I'm not the head opponent, but I try to share visions with him and of course with you. And let me start with a very simple exercise. Let's imagine for a minute that the 4 Busan principles are on fire and you need to save just one of the 4 principles. So, which principle would you save? Don't answer me, just think about it. And let's repeat the same exercise now, but let's think about the 2030 agenda. Now the Agenda 2030 is on fire, and we know that the Agenda 2030 is on fire, in fact. And we need to save, or we could save just one principle. Which one would you save? And now, please tell me, in the first case, who of you thought about the ownership as a principle to be rescued? I want to know. A lot of you. And how many, in the second case, how many of you thought about the leave no one behind principle? Please raise your hands. So, as we can see, we are talking about 2 very important, very core principles in the new international cooperation agenda. So, I think that the question now, or the real question, is about how to include the leave no one behind perspective and how to link it with the SDGs implementation process to find an answer. I think that we will need to consider some relevant points. And the first one, linked with the exercise we just did, is that tensions between the leave no one behind and the ownership principles are unavoidable. And we have to bear it in mind. We cannot think that we can overcome the issue without talk or without face any trade-off necessities between the 2 principles. And maybe the first and more real question now is how we will manage the trade-offs between these 2 principles. So the first issue to consider is that the effectiveness agenda, I think if we are looking for a solution, the effectiveness agenda must contribute to SDGs implementation. And as a consequence, it should be aligned with the 2030 agenda. I mean, the effectiveness agenda, it's a development effectiveness agenda. And the 2030 agenda sets the basic goals of the development according to our state's commitments. I mean, we are now talking about sustainable development, and we are now talking about a set of specific goals that we have to reach in the next 14 years. And the second issue to take into account is that to respect, if you want to respect the ownership principle, the first identification of groups being left behind is a task and a responsibility of the recipient governments. I agree with my colleague. And it's a responsibility of the recipients' governments as part of the design of their own path to development. The governments have the right to decide their own way to development. But now they have to do it in a context of the 2030 agenda. So they could decide the ways, but they couldn't decide the goals because they just decide them in a community forum. But ownership is not an absolute shield. We have not to consider the ownership as a national shield against any way of intervention for any other states, or maybe we cannot think about the ownership as a principle who let the recipient states do whatever they want. And donors countries also must or can consider that some groups are being left behind by the recipients. And then they could work with other national development actors to influence government decisions and policies. That's why to support the building of enabling environments aimed to facilitate broader participation of representatives of civil society organizations, but also private sector, academia, unions, and any other stakeholder, is crucial to the success of the sustainable development implementation efforts. The real importance of supporting multi-stakeholders engagement is due to the fact that the solutions of the problems arising from tensions between ownership and leave no one behind principles is not a technical but a political issue. And we have not any global recipe to solve the problems we will surely face in the near future. And if the question is it's a political one, the solution must need to be a political one also. So we need to improve the participation of all the interested stakeholders, and we need to create the tools to let them get an effective participation, to let them reach a real voice and a real capacity to be part of the national decisions. And I think that it will be one of the more important tasks of the new global development agenda. Because we need to remember that this agenda is not only an agenda for the governments, but also an agenda for the people. And it calls us to think out of the box and to look for new tools and new ways to implement the sustainable development as a common responsibility. And this common is not about all the states, but it's about all the peoples, all the groups. And of course, we need to create common and to find common solutions to these kind of tensions. I'm sure that in the near future, we will face a lot of problems like this. In fact, there is not the first time in history that we are facing problems like this. I remember some discussions that are close to this one that we are holding now, when we started to think about conditionality and human rights. And if the donor states could cut their cooperation with the recipients based on human rights decisions or parameters. And I think that we are very close with that discussion, because leave no one behind is also a dignity and human rights imperative. So to finish, because we need time to questions and answer, for finishing my participation, like I told you, we have not any global recipe to solve the problems we are facing now and the problems that we are facing in the near future. But if we want to succeed in our attempt to leave no one behind and to build a more sustainable world, we must work together and listen all the voices and give participation to all the actors. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Javier. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, as you say, it's not a new issue. This is not the first time we've been here, but I think that the 2030 agenda does bring some of these questions right back to the forefront. So thank you very much for submitting your questions and voting for the questions on Pigeonhole. There are two questions that seem to be overwhelmingly of interest to you. So what I'm going to suggest is that we focus on those two questions, which are a little bit related. And I'd like to hear from the panelists, but I think what I might do is to start by opening to the floor to see if anybody out there has got answers to these questions. So the first one is...